1602. A group of Dutch merchants create a company that will become the most valuable corporation in human history. At its peak, the Dutch East India Company, the VOC, would be worth $7.9 trillion in today's money. That's more than Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and Tesla combined. Times 3. But here's what makes this company unlike any modern corporation. The VOC didn't just trade. It waged wars. It signed treaties with foreign nations. It minted its own currency. It maintained its own army and navy. It governed territories larger than most European countries. It could execute prisoners and establish colonies. The Dutch government gave one company the power to act as a sovereign state. For nearly 200 years, the VOC was the most powerful commercial entity on Earth. It pioneered shareholder capitalism, invented the modern stock exchange, and created financial instruments we still use today. It made fortunes for its investors through dividends that sometimes reached over 40% annually. It transformed Amsterdam into the financial capital of the world. It also committed atrocities that would make modern corporations blush. The VOC massacred entire populations to control spice production. It enslaved hundreds of thousands of people. It engaged in piracy, bribery, and economic warfare as normal business practices. The company's motto might as well have been maximize shareholder value by any means necessary. The story of the Dutch East India Company isn't just history. It's the origin story of modern capitalism. Every innovation we associate with today's markets, from publicly traded stock to corporate governance to hostile takeovers, was pioneered or perfected by the VOC. Every criticism of modern corporations, from exploitation of foreign labor to environmental destruction to capture of government, was demonstrated by the VOC on an epic scale. And here's the uncomfortable truth. The VOC succeeded spectacularly for 2 centuries using methods that today we'd call crimes against humanity. It proved that ruthless exploitation combined with innovative finance can generate extraordinary wealth. The question is whether we've actually moved beyond that model or just made it less visible. Jan Pieterszoon Cohen was the VOC's most ruthless and effective governor-general. He served in the early 1600s and established Dutch dominance in the East Indies through systematic violence. Cohen believed that trade should be conducted through war and war through trade. Under his leadership, the VOC massacred the population of the Banda Islands to establish a monopoly on nutmeg. When questioned about the brutality, Cohen replied that you cannot have trade without war, nor war without trade. He's remembered in Indonesia as a genocidal colonizer. In the Netherlands, he was celebrated as a business hero until quite recently. Johan van Oldenbarnevelt was the Dutch statesman who created the VOC by forcing competing Dutch trading companies to merge into a single entity. He understood that the Dutch needed to pool resources to compete with the Portuguese and Spanish in Asia. Van Oldenbarnevelt structured the VOC as a joint stock company, allowing it to raise capital from thousands of investors. This innovation would change capitalism forever. Ironically, Van Oldenbarnevelt was later executed for treason in unrelated political disputes. The company he created outlived him by nearly 2 centuries. The Heren 17, the Gentlemen 17, were the board of directors who governed the VOC. They were representatives from the 6 regional chambers of the company, with the Amsterdam chamber dominating. The Heren 17 set policy, appointed governors, and distributed profits. They met in person only a few times per year because travel between chambers was difficult. This distance between ownership and operations created some of the first principal-agent problems in corporate history. Abel Tasman was the VOC explorer who discovered New Zealand and Tasmania while searching for profitable trade routes. The VOC funded exploration not for science or glory but to find new markets and resources to exploit. Many of the great geographic discoveries of the 17th century were byproducts of the VOC's commercial ambitions. The VOC soldiers and sailors were often men with no better options. The company recruited from the poorest classes of Europe, offering wages and adventure. The mortality rate was horrific. Disease, shipwrecks, and combat killed huge numbers. But there were always more desperate men willing to take the risk. The VOC's business model depended on treating human lives as expendable resources. To understand why the VOC became so powerful, you need to understand the European spice trade and why spices were literally worth their weight in gold. In the 1600s, spices from Asia were extraordinarily valuable in Europe. Pepper, nutmeg, cloves, cinnamon, these weren't just flavor enhancers. They were preservatives for meat, ingredients for medicine, and status symbols for the wealthy. A handful of nutmeg could be worth more than a house. But getting spices from Asia to Europe was incredibly difficult and dangerous. The journey took years. Ships could sink. Crews could mutiny or die from disease. Pirates could attack. If you made it back alive with a cargo of spices, you'd be rich. But the odds weren't great. The Portuguese had dominated the spice trade in the 1500s. They'd established a route around Africa to the East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, where many valuable spices originated. The Portuguese set up trading posts, made deals with local rulers, and used military force to control supply. But by the late 1500s, the Dutch wanted in. The Netherlands had recently gained independence from Spain and was emerging as a major commercial power. Dutch merchants had money and ambition. They started sending ships to Asia to compete with the Portuguese. The problem was competition among the Dutch themselves. Multiple Dutch companies were sending ships, often bidding against each other for spices, driving up costs and reducing profits. This made no sense. So Dutch leaders decided to force a merger. In 1602, the Dutch government chartered the Verenigd Oost-Indisch Company, the United East India Company, known as the VOC. All the competing Dutch companies were merged into one, and the government gave this company extraordinary powers. The VOC had a monopoly on Dutch trade with Asia. It could wage war and make peace. It could establish colonies and administer justice. It could mint money and conduct diplomacy. No other commercial entity in history had been granted such sweeping authority. The VOC was structured as a joint stock company. Instead of individual merchants funding individual voyages, investors bought shares in the company. The company would use that capital to fund many voyages simultaneously. Profits would be distributed as dividends. This structure meant the VOC could raise enormous amounts of capital and sustain operations even when individual voyages failed. This was revolutionary. Before the VOC, most businesses were partnerships or family enterprises. The VOC created permanent capital that didn't disappear when founders died. It created transferable shares that could be bought and sold. It created the first real stock exchange in Amsterdam where VOC shares traded actively. The VOC also pioneered modern corporate governance, though not always successfully. The company had a separation between ownership and management. Shareholders owned the company but didn't run daily operations. The board of directors hired professional managers. This created conflicts of interest and agency problems that are still debated today. The company raised 6.5 million guilders in its initial offering, an enormous sum for the time. This gave the VOC resources far beyond any competitor. They could build more ships, hire more soldiers, establish more trading posts. They could sustain losses that would bankrupt smaller enterprises. And they used those resources ruthlessly. The VOC's strategy was to establish monopolies by any means necessary. If local rulers wouldn't grant exclusive trading rights, the VOC would use military force. If rival European traders tried to compete, the VOC would drive them out through price wars or violence. If supply of a commodity was too high, the VOC would destroy crops or kill producers to keep prices elevated. The first VOC voyage departed in 1603 with 4 ships. The goal was to reach the East Indies, load up with spices, and return to Amsterdam. The journey would take over 2 years. 2 of the 4 ships made it back. But the profits from the spices they carried were so large that the voyage was considered a success despite losing half the fleet. Over the next few decades, the VOC expanded rapidly. They established a headquarters in Batavia, modern-day Jakarta, in 1619. Jan Pietersoen Cohen forced the local sultan to grant land and used it to build a fortified city that would become the center of VOC operations in Asia. Batavia was more than a trading post. It was a colonial capital. The VOC governed the city and surrounding territories. They collected taxes, enforced laws, and maintained order through military force. The Dutch were building an empire under corporate control. The VOC's most notorious action was the conquest of the Banda Islands. These small islands were the world's only source of nutmeg, an incredibly valuable spice. The local Bandanese had been trading with multiple European and Asian merchants. The VOC wanted a monopoly. In 1621, Jan Pieterszoon Cohen led a military expedition to the Banda Islands. The VOC massacred or enslaved virtually the entire native population, approximately 15,000 people. They then imported Dutch and Javanese settlers to work nutmeg plantations under VOC control. This genocide established a complete monopoly on nutmeg production. The massacre worked commercially. The VOC controlled nutmeg supply and could set prices as high as they wanted. Shareholders received enormous dividends. Nobody in Amsterdam seemed bothered by the methods used to generate those profits. Throughout the 1600s, the VOC expanded its operations across Asia. They established trading posts in Japan, Taiwan, India, Ceylon, and South Africa. The Cape Colony in South Africa was founded as a supply station for VOC ships traveling between Europe and Asia. It would eventually become a major colonial settlement. The VOC's commercial success made Amsterdam the financial center of Europe. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, created primarily to trade VOC shares, became the model for stock markets everywhere. Financial innovations like short selling, options trading, and even the first recorded stock market bubble all happened with VOC shares. At its peak in the late 1600s, the VOC had over 50,000 employees and operated over 200 ships. It was far larger than the armies of most European nations. The company's reach extended across half the globe. Its annual revenue exceeded that of entire countries. But success bred problems. The company was difficult to manage across such vast distances. Communications between Amsterdam and Asia took over a year-round trip. Local governors had enormous autonomy and often pursued their own interests rather than company policy. Corruption was rampant. The VOC also faced increasing competition. The British East India Company was growing in power. Other European nations were establishing their own trading companies. The monopolies the VOC had established through violence were becoming harder to maintain. By the 1700s, the VOC's finances were deteriorating. Wars were expensive. Maintaining colonies was costly. Corruption was eating into profits. The company paid dividends not from current profits but by borrowing, essentially a Ponzi scheme. The debt kept growing. The Fourth Anglo-Dutch War in 1780 to 1784 was disastrous for the VOC. The British captured many VOC ships and trading posts. The company never recovered. By the 1790s, the VOC was effectively bankrupt. In 1799, the Dutch government dissolved the company and took over its assets and debts. The VOC lasted nearly 200 years. It generated enormous wealth for its shareholders. It established Dutch presence across Asia that lasted for centuries. But it also left a legacy of violence, exploitation, and colonial brutality that still shapes the world today. If you think the VOC is ancient history with no relevance to today, think about how modern corporations operate in developing countries. The parallels are uncomfortable. The VOC had a monopoly granted by government. Today, tech companies like Google and Facebook have near monopolies in their markets, not by government grant but by network effects and acquisition of competitors. The result is similar: enormous market power with limited competition. The VOC extracted resources and wealth from colonies for the benefit of shareholders in Amsterdam. Today, multinational corporations extract resources and profit from developing countries while shareholders in New York, London, and Tokyo collect the returns. The wealth flows in the same direction. The VOC used military force to establish favorable business conditions. Today, corporations lobby governments to intervene militarily or economically to protect their interests. The United Fruit Company and its role in Latin American coups is a 20th-century echo of VOC methods. The VOC pioneered labor practices that today we'd call slavery or forced labor. Modern supply chains often depend on exploitative labor in countries with weak regulations. The geographic distance between consumers and producers creates the same moral distance the VOC shareholders had from violence committed in their name. The VOC had agency problems where local managers pursued their own interests rather than shareholder interests. Modern corporations struggle with the same issues. Executives pursue short-term gains that benefit themselves while creating long-term problems for companies and society. The most direct parallel might be to companies operating in weak or failed states. In places where government authority is limited, Corporations sometimes provide security, build infrastructure, and effectively govern territories. This looks a lot like what the VOC did. The difference is we're supposed to have international law now preventing that. We also see VOC-style monopoly tactics in modern business. Amazon has been accused of using its platform power to destroy competitors. Tech companies acquire potential competitors before they become threats. Pharmaceutical companies extend patents to maintain monopolies. The methods are legal now, but the goal of eliminating competition is the same. The financial innovations of the VOC era, particularly around stock trading and speculation, have modern equivalents. High-frequency trading, derivatives, and complex financial instruments all have roots in the financial experimentation that happened around VOC shares in Amsterdam. The Dutch East India Company teaches us three fundamental truths about capitalism that we'd rather not acknowledge. First, the institutions we consider essential to modern capitalism were built on exploitation. Shareholder companies, stock markets, corporate governance, these innovations were developed to efficiently extract wealth from colonized territories. They weren't created to benefit workers or communities. They were designed to benefit investors. That original purpose is still embedded in how these institutions function. Second, giving corporations power normally reserved for states is incredibly dangerous. The VOC could wage war, establish colonies, and execute prisoners because the Dutch government granted those powers. Today, we've mostly ended that practice, at least formally. But corporations still have enormous influence over governments. They still shape policy in their favor. The power is more subtle but perhaps more pervasive. Third, geographic and moral distance enables atrocity. VOC shareholders in Amsterdam could collect dividends from nutmeg while ignoring that those profits came from genocide. Modern consumers can buy cheap products while ignoring exploitative labor conditions because the suffering happens far away. The mechanism is the same. Distance permits indifference. Here's the question we should ask. Are modern corporations fundamentally different from the VOC, or have we just constrained their worst impulses through regulation and norms? And are those constraints permanent, or could they erode if we're not vigilant? The VOC showed that ruthless exploitation combined with innovative finance generates extraordinary wealth. Modern corporations operate under more constraints, at least in theory. But the incentive structure is similar. Maximize shareholder value. Externalize costs. Exploit advantages wherever you find them. The methods are more civilized. The goal is the same. If this video made you think differently about where capitalism came from and what it was designed to do, share it. Because understanding the origins of our economic system is essential to reforming it. Subscribe for more explorations of financial history and what it teaches us about the present. The Dutch East India Company was the most valuable corporation ever. It was also one of the most brutal. Those two facts are connected. And we should remember that connection when we think about corporate power today.